So I'm just waiting for Anastasis to join us, and we're hoping to have a discussion on the application of the oxygen advantage for yoga. So I think this will be interesting because there are so many people teaching yoga and so many people who are actively engaged in yoga. And of course, yoga would be a great modality in terms of getting out there functional breathing. So join us. And Anastasis knows a lot more about yoga than I do. And I think this is going to be a good discussion. So Anastasis, welcome.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm very well. Is that camera setup good?
Say that again. I'm just waiting for... I can hear you now well.
Can you hear? I can hear you very well. Can you hear me?
Perfect. So yeah, I kind of gave a brief introduction, and I kind of mentioned to people that we're going to talk about yoga and the oxygen advantage, or the application of functional breathing to yoga, and your own experience on it. Maybe just give a brief background, Anastasis, that people, so that they have an idea who you are, what you do.
I'm a yoga teacher. I've been for 8 years, and I want to point out this thing in my journey that when I was teaching yoga in the beginning, I was avoiding teaching anything to do with breathing because I didn't feel I know enough. I remember the feedback of many of my students was, we like your classes, but compared to other teachers, you don't speak much about breathing. And I said, that's as far as I know. And I went from not teaching anything about breathing to teaching oxygen advantage workshops and all sorts.
Yeah. And before that, Anastasis, you were a paratrooper.
Correct, yeah.
And you were also involved in finance.
Correct. So I guess similar to you, I had my own journey through highly stressful environments. And I think when one knows firsthand what it means to see heavy breathing, even when there is zero muscular activation, when someone is sitting in front of the screen, but the breath can be heard throughout a corridor, we know that there is something not right. And intuitively, maybe a lot of people, hopefully, that are listening relate to that, but maybe they don't know, so what's not right? And then, of course, the answers are basically, I found a lot of answers in your work.
And I think people might not necessarily be aware of it, because if we are doing it all the time, we're not going to see the forest for the trees. And I was like that as well. I was a child, and I going into my early 20s, and you would always hear me breathing during rest, and I had regular sighing. So you came across breathing then primarily as a result of stress.
Yeah, and also in my yoga journey, and also I would say that through the Wim Hof work, where I dipped my toes and I got involved, but I was not finding the answers that I wanted. So yes, stress, but I would also say yoga opened the doors. And as I said earlier, when I don't understand something, I prefer not to speak. But at the same time, I look for the question, the answer.
Yes. That's a good approach. That's not always the approach that people take, They often say fake it until you make it.
Yeah, not
ideal.
Not ideal, not for me. And that's really what I think is very important for people that are interested in both yoga and the oxygen advantage, who hopefully are on this call at the moment, is that I encourage them to really try to digest as much of your work and the oxygen advantage work, because the nose and the lungs and the respiratory system is the same, whether we are running, whether we are in an office and we want to have good focus, or when we are on a yoga mat. One of the things that trigger me is when I hear, oh, this is the Pilates breathing and this is the yoga breathing, and this is, okay, we can have different techniques and maybe everything serves some purpose. But if we want to achieve a certain goal, there is an optimal and the suboptimal breathing. And
Totally.
that's what I think, and I would definitely feel that it was only through getting myself involved through the oxygen advantage material, and later on continuing my studies with you, that I came to get my head around that there is a safe way that can keep yoga practitioners away from asthma attacks. Because I don't know how, if you know, there are many people, and maybe some of the people participating now, and maybe they want to share their experience. When I was teaching a lot of, in the post-COVID era, group classes, there were many people that they would have their inhalers next to their mat.
Yes.
Imagine they do something that in theory they makes their, in theory, because who knows, they make their breathing better, they calm the nervous system, yet they expect an asthma attack. It does not match. It does not, you know.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
So I think there is a very, and we have discussed that. I had the opportunity to discuss that with you. I think there is a great overlap between the oxygen advantage work and the yogic breathing. You have mentioned it in previous calls as well.
I'm interested to hear, when you were teaching yoga to your students, how do you instruct them to breathe? What are you looking for? What dimensions are you targeting? You know, if they're doing different postures, people, invariably your students will want to be taking full big breaths, but can you teach them full big breathing without over breathing? So how's your take on it? How have you changed it?
Yeah, so I would not, first off, I think there is, we have to acknowledge that a yoga class can be as relaxing or as challenging as possible. And I have been on the receiving end of being told how to breathe when I was struggling with the physical aspect of the postures. So I think it is worth realizing that when we are struggling, when we are trying to do something we've never done before, not breathing in an optimal way is okay, and not be critical. I don't think we need to be, I still try not to be a breathing terrorist, so to speak. Even though I know maybe what is the ideal, I know that it's not potentially possible for this individual at the time. Imagine someone with a kyphotic back, someone stiff. You know, I cannot expect him to breathe very lightly. So in general, keeping his mouth closed or her mouth closed, I think it's a good starting point.
And in terms of sound, when you're teaching yoga, do you hear your students breathing in the class while they do light postures? Or
there is a lot of wiring. There is a lot of programming, I should say, of people that are like, this is good. Now I did it once. And if you were to see, my cat did not like the sound. She was sitting in front opposite me. It's like, it is very taxing for the throat. And that's the question I had asked sometimes students. So does it feel good for your throat? It says, no. Sometimes my throat hurt after the class. So then why are you doing it? And the answer would be, this is what my teacher has told, or some other teacher had said. So I said, okay, ask why, because maybe there is a reason I don't know. But otherwise, in the meantime, at least in my classes, keep it soft and calm, because maybe this will calm the nervous system down as well, and you will be able to perform what you want to perform in terms of postures more comfortable.
Yeah, I think it makes total sense. I was in Seattle, and I see somebody joined us from Seattle there. Robin Rottenberg, she's in Falls City in Seattle. She's about a half an hour outside of Seattle, maybe more, but not that much more. I watched her work with her students, and you would never hear them breathe. And she was instructing such light, moving the breath with the change in the posture. And as you move very, very slowly, you're breathing both light, both slow, and both deep. And when you see it being practiced in yoga, it's really amazing, because then we know that the points that you touched upon. Yoga then, for example, can be a tool to increase blood flow. It can be a tool to increase oxygen delivery throughout the body. and it can be a tool to calm the central nervous system. And I think when yoga originated, if we were to read, for example, Robin's book, we will see that the ancient yogis, they spoke one word in terms of breathing, and that word was, we need to breathe subtle. And what does the word subtle mean? But it means light, it means imperceptible, it means that we are hardly breathing at all. Now, and I find that very interesting because obviously it has changed somewhat. And then we have yoga instructors like yourself. You're based in London. You're you know, well appreciated as a yoga instructor. You know, you've got a very good background in breathing and how you're bringing both modalities together.
I want to point out something, Patrick, which so far you have been covering the more hypercapnic side of breath work, where, you know, we breathe slowly and by increasing. I don't want to get too technical. I don't know what the background of all of the participants is, but I'm going to tell you something which I have not told before. I have found the hypoxic, the other pillar of breath work, has a fantastic use in yoga, not for the obvious reasons that hypoxia has been trained for, which, you know, the high altitude and simulation benefits, but because it increases concentration and abdominal pressure. And this is another tool which, since I studied with you, I have been introducing in a lot more in my teaching and my own practice, and it can be a very, very powerful tool. When we are holding our breath, we are increasing adrenaline to some extent, concentration goes up. Even for meditation, holding our breath can tune us in with our heartbeat, but also abdominal pressure. Like if I was to take a punch, I would be able to take it much easier if I was holding my breath.
Yes.
And this can be so useful in some postures. I cannot tell you how many students I had that said, hold your breath. This is hard for you. You want to increase abdominal pressure. Hold your breath and do it. And says, it happened. I said, yes, but if you were exhaling and relaxing, this is hard. Because that's, as we said before, there is the calming practice, and there is the one that is more challenging and needs more of an oomph, let's say. And this is, again, another overlap.
And I'm assuming that you're exhaling and holding.
Or inhaling.
For a generation of intra-abdominal pressure, you will inhale and hold.
Yes, I think that it varies. I cannot say that there is always one formula. I would say sometimes even to students, decide for yourself if you want to hold your breath at the end of the inhalation and exhalation. If there is not a lot of compression needed, and I think even inhaling can work.
Yeah,
because it is very useful.
With the inhalation, I think it's common, isn't it, when people are lifting a weight that they will breathe in. And as they breathe in, the diaphragm is distending down during the inhalation, which is, it's almost that the abdomen becomes like a pneumatic balloon to provide stabilization for the spine.
Now, this is not the news to people that you work with. Well, I know you have done a lot of work with people that do CrossFit and other high impact and with a lot of weight. But of course, in yoga, we don't use weights. But we still need to have a midsection. People speak about the core, but they say, keep breathing. If I'm breathing, my belly will be moving all the time. It's not the time to get my belly moving. I'm talking about, like, you know, the more challenging postures, not when we are like in relaxation, or not when we want to improve delivery of oxygen. I just wanted to point it out. I don't think we have discussed that before, but I think it's another overlap between the practice of yoga and the oxygen advantage.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. And because dysfunctional breathing patterns are quite common, especially in some groups of the population. Those people, and I'd imagine that a lot of those people will be going towards yoga. People with anxiety, people with panic disorder, because yoga is really about union, isn't it? It's about body and mind coming together, union with life. So a lot of people who are stressed, anxious will gravitate towards yoga. and 75% of that population has dysfunctional breathing patterns. You know, so that's where nose breathing, low breathing, light breathing, slow breathing, deep breathing would come in.
It is so funny for me to hear you saying these words, because I use the same words. Of course, I have studied with you. And at the same time, at the moment, with the second lockdown about to commence tomorrow in London, there is a lot of promotion going around about the use of breath. And the phrases that they are using are the exact opposite of the language that you are using. So you would see, like, you know, there is one like called Big Breath. Come to this workshop of Big Breath. We need it for COVID. The big breath will feel good temporarily when we dampen the carbon dioxide. Like, it will have a very short, good effect. But it's not going to get us calm after like 10 minutes. You will come out, maybe even if we overdo it, maybe we will even like feel like lightheaded.
Lightheaded, yeah. I was talking with Rebecca Coles this morning, and I remember 1997 or 1996, I was doing an exam, and I was very nervous about it. It was fourth year finals, and I was just after reading a book by Paul Wilson, I think it's back then, called Calm, and he said, take these full big breaths. So I thought, great idea, went for a walk, filling my lungs full of air, went into the exam hall. Absolutely, I was totally lightheaded. I was already a crap breather anyway at that time, and the exaggerated breathing brought on by it was absolutely the wrong thing to do. You can only imagine the number of people who think that it's beneficial to fill their lungs full of air.
I mean, one of the things to echoing, you know, the things that I have learned from you. One of the things that my response when people say, but don't I want to bring more air into my lungs? And I say, there are many reasons why that might not be a good idea, but let's establish this. The lungs don't like too much pressure anyway. So if you keep forcing a lot of air in through the mouth or the nose, they will start shrinking soon after. So the reality, what you think you're doing just by forcing more air in, which potentially will have other impacts on carbon dioxide and so on, will actually ultimately change your physiology. So don't make assumptions because the air comes in and it's forceful that it will be delivered on your cells and on your brain. Just intuitively, I think we have been like we have lost our intuition, let's put it this way, because
yes.
Misguided.
But there also has been vested interests, I think, in terms of the stories of why carbon dioxide is such bad press. For example, James Nestor's book, Breath, and we've always seen a very positive role for carbon dioxide, especially when you look at the functions of carbon dioxide in the human body, a vasodilator, you know, increasing the release of oxygen from the red blood cells to the tissues and organs, the primary maintenance of blood, normalization of blood pH, calming of the central nervous system, as we spoke about. But in the 1930s, I think, if I remember correctly from James Nestor's book, there was one doctor, his name was Dr. Waters in the United States, and he came out very, very prolific against carbon dioxide. And he was saying, in quote, it was as toxic as urine. And as a result, carbon dioxide then really got bad press. And carbon dioxide treatment for people with anxiety and panic disorder then wasn't used in the hospitals. But if we go to the Roman times, you think of the baths that people were doing, the thermal springs, they were very rich in bicarbonate, carbon dioxide. And even to drink some of the spring water when it's coming from Eastern Europe, I remember getting a bottle of, it was a water somebody brought into a workshop, they just came from Romania. And I drank the water and it was really, really high in bicarbonate. You could taste it. You know, so human beings, we have been utilizing the benefits of carbon dioxide for generations and generations. And this is something that has been lost to this generation, because we have an idea that it's good to breathe in as much oxygen as possible
and get rid of as much carbon dioxide as possible. And carbon dioxide is often referred to as the toxic gas. But it's amazing, isn't it? It really is how an idea gets hold. And I think it was that one individual, Dr. Waters, who was at least partly responsible for the idea of the toxicity of carbon dioxide.
And I mean, obviously, I have not looked into that case. I've read James Nestor's book, but I think a lot of the times, and bringing it back a little bit to yoga, I think that if some participants in the some listeners to the conversation know of a yoga teacher that they said, take a big breath in or keep breathing, don't stop breathing. I don't think they mean bad. I think we all do I think we all behave in the best interest that we think of ourselves and the people around us. But it's maybe not, they have not done enough research, and they have been misguided themselves. So I think that a lot of ideas become popular and become viral, unfortunately, when they really don't have any foundation. That's why I think it's good to question things and keep...
Anastasis, sorry to cut across you, but that's the point that you mentioned at the very, very start. You didn't feel comfortable teaching about breathing until you knew something about it. You know, I think it's really, really important. I think anybody who teaches breathing should have a basic understanding of the physiology of even just the Bohr effect. And of course, it's not just about the biochemistry of the breath. We need to bring in the biomechanics, and we also need to bring in slow breathing, resonance frequency breathing. But they are all interconnected. So, you know, I'm just putting together kind of a diagram. It's a circle diagram of how the biochemistry is overlapping with the biomechanics. And when you have functional breathing using the diaphragm breathing low, that slow breathing then is influencing resonance frequency breathing. And when you have improved by practicing resonance frequency breathing, it in turn modifies the chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. So the biochemistry, biomechanics, and frequency of the breath is absolutely interlinked. And in the middle, where all three overlap, is the nose. Because when we breathe through the nose, it improves the biochemistry. When we breathe through the nose, we tend to breathe low. And when we breathe through the nose, we breathe slow. Because the nose, of course, during wakefulness imposes a resistance to breathing that's 2 to 3 times that of the mouth. So, yeah, you know what? I think part of it is this. I was having a conversation with Alessandro. He's one of our master instructors. He's a clinical psychologist, and he's based in Italy. And we were talking about religion. And we were talking about that when I think it was the Crusaders were coming from, was it the Crusaders? Well, basically travelers coming from the Eastern world to Rome in the, you know, during the centuries. They were bringing their prophecies or bringing their philosophies with them. But the Catholic Church didn't want to embrace them because the philosophies or the teachings were a little bit in contradiction to which the Catholic Church was teaching. Even though when we have to think about the basis of all religion, and certainly at the core of that is presence, and certainly at the core of that is connecting with life, not staying stuck in our head. And, you know, even when we look at the research by Bernardi that in the Catholic faith, for example, saying the rosary religion, it slowed down the respiratory rate down to 6 breaths per minute, which is the optimal speed to stimulate the vagus nerve, to increase the sensitivity of the baroreceptors, to influence the autonomic nervous system. But here's my point. Breathing is very much based on tradition. And traditions don't like overlapping with other traditions. So when one is taught according to one tradition, it's very difficult for that student to go outside of that, because they will feel almost that they're not a traitor, but they might feel that, you know, they're critical of the tradition that they taught in by virtue of they having to go outside the boundaries. So you know, is sometimes with breathing, it's very much my way is the only way to do it, no matter which way you are trained. And personally, I have to say, I have found that many people, when they have been trained in one particular tradition, they are not as open-minded as you, put it that way, to go deeper into the breath and just ask, what is happening here? Question it, because that's how we move on. That's how we make advances.
I think I think what you're saying is, I think holds true and is relevant with yoga, because yoga, of course, is thousands of years old. So whenever one practices it, and I have felt like that many times myself, they feel that they are touching upon something that has a lot of history and has benefited many of their ancestors. And this is great. This is fantastic thing. But then with it comes the idea that, okay, so either I have to do that, which my teacher says, which his teacher said, which her teacher said, and so on, or I'm not really tapping into this, into the benefits. I'm not really a proper yoga student. While I don't think that there is, I think we need to question. I think, yeah, we need to say, okay, that's the fantastic tradition with a lot of benefits. Now, with the current knowledge from science, because, you know, the Buteyko, who you have been teaching for many, many years, has had studies of assessing, even like from the control pose or bolt score, or, you know, there's a few aspects of it. Is there some overlap? Can we learn something? I like to use a lot it's an example that I really like from the Pilates world, which, you know, in some people it's like they see it as the opposite of yoga. In the reality is that there is also very many overlaps there, and they complement actually very well each other. And Pilates emphasized on breathing from the mouth. So that's why if you walk into a Pilates class, you will hear a lot of, which I'm not going to criticize. But it's interesting, because one of the other things that Pilates, who is fantastic, I think he offered a lot to the physical world, physical exercise world, is that he thought that the spine should be straight. He thought that the human spine is meant to be perfectly straight. And now, of course, if you tell anyone, they will say, okay, you know, we know that it should have 3 curves, and there is the kyphotic and the lordotic. Should we write off everything that Pilates has said because he had this mistake, or because maybe the breathing that he was teaching was not optimal?
Yes. Yeah, yes. Yeah, I agree. I understand the point you're making. Yeah, it's very interesting. What we just do is, we said we do about 20 minutes or so of a discussion, and if anybody has any questions, that we'll try and answer any questions. So I'm just going to move down here and see what questions people have posted. I think a lot of people shallow breathe. Sorry, there, it's after disappearing me. So that's what happens when people don't question and don't quantify the impact of detrimental deep breathing. I've worked out that even paced breathing is stressing me out, or even box breathing. So I think, Ivy, if paced breathing or box breathing is stressing you out, it just might indicate that you've got a stronger chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. And we use control pause with Buteyko or bolt score with oxygen advantage. And again, you know, this is the length of your comfortable breath hold time during rest. And it's often lower with people who have poorer breathing patterns. So, for example, people who hyperventilate or overbreathe tend to have a lower breath hold time. And it does indicate that a stronger chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. But basically, if you have difficulty slowing down your respiratory rate down to 6 breaths per minute, and maybe the air hunger is too much, then what I would say to you is, instead of breathing 6 breaths per minute during the practice, maybe breathe in for 3 seconds and out for 3 seconds. So therefore, you're going to be breathing 10 breaths per minute, and it'll be a little bit easier. But I'd also say is, nose breathe both day and night. And also, if you're young, just check the relationship between hormonal changes and breathing, because for women, breathing is very much different than men. And Anastasis, there's another field that has been overlooked. Since 1915, it has been known that women's breathing is different than men. It's been written about, and women going through the menstrual cycle, women during days 10 to days 22 when progesterone levels are increasing, and I think this is the mid-luteal to mid-follicular phase. Sometimes I get mixed up with them, being a typical man. But at the same time, so when progesterone levels increase, and this in turn then is stimulating breathing, so women have a greater tendency to hyperventilate during this time. Their carbon dioxide levels can drop by 25%. And with this, increased pain, increased fatigue, increased sensitivity to carbon dioxide, increased exhaustion and increased anxiety. And also premenstrual syndrome, PMS, influenced by breathing. And is there anybody teaching these women how to gently soften and slow down breathing patterns to improve functional breathing so that you're better able to buffer any changes due to, say, changes in hormones? A great role for yoga, because maybe I'm biased, but oftentimes I feel that more women attend yoga than men. And, you know, taking into consideration hormonal changes in the female could be very important.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
very, very interesting. I think you will be bringing all of this content that you're saying now into your teachings in the 2021, right?
yeah, it's a new book. I've just written a new book, but it's going to be a little bit before it gets published. It's a bit like the Oxygen Advantage. I thought it was finished, and then I realized that I have a bit more to go. So every time people ask me, when is it going to be finished, I tell them 4 weeks' time. And of course, 4 weeks happens and it doesn't happen. But I'm going to pass a question over to you, because does breathing help herniated disc in neck and back? It is so bad. I feel tingling in feet, and I'm not sure that word, aetius in elbows, so bad I want to cry.
So I think, as you pointed out, so obviously there is it seems like there is an acute state in which I don't know the name of the person asking the question, but
1 second, I'll get it for you here. So it's from Tanya.
Tanya, okay. So Tanya, yeah, it seems like it is quite acute. I can see the emojis, and for sure, like palliative practice might be necessary at this stage. But as Patrick pointed out earlier, the diaphragm is, apart from a respiratory muscle, an abdominal muscle as well. It is developing quite fast, around, I think, 4 months of growth when we start moving our external extremities, our legs and limbs, because it helps with coordination. With that in mind, strengthening your diaphragm, even if you cannot target the area where your hernia is at the moment, might definitely support the long-term health of your abdomen and your injury. And also, you know, all the work of the Pilates, where the pelvic floor, which is the opposite side of diaphragm. Yeah, so breathing can go a long way towards supporting you. Towards healing, but depending on how acute the problem is, I don't want to promise go off and do XYZ type of breathing and you will heal your hernia. But I definitely would say that it is very much related, because obviously you are like, it is in the area that where you have the injury at the moment.
I think
close by.
Anastasis, I think it would be also beneficial for Tanya just to check, where does she breathe? You know, is she breathing through her mouth or breathing through the nose? And is she breathing high? So, for example, if she is breathing high, fast and shallow, because we must think of the diaphragm, just as we spoke about, you mentioned earlier on, it's not just for respiration, but it's also for the generation of intra-abdominal pressure. And it's very common for people with lower back pain. I know it's a little bit different, but people with lower back pain, it's very common for them to have dysfunctional breathing patterns. So the diaphragm, we really need to restore functional breathing there.
Patrick, I managed to read the comment while you were speaking, and what you said, lower back, but also upper back, the hernia, from what I'm reading, is on the neck. So, of course, I don't know the spine of this individual, but a kyphotic posture, we know that restricts the movement of the diaphragm. So, again, is there some level of kyphosis in this individual? I don't know, but there is, and if the hernia is around the neck, maybe that's another element that needs to be assessed.
Sure, sure. On the exaggerated exhale with diaphragmatic breathing, is it true that we increase the CO2 in the blood and release more CO2 in the lungs to make room for O2? On the exaggerated exhalation with diaphragmatic breathing, is it true that we increase the CO2 in the blood? Well, the increase of CO2 in the blood will all be influenced by your alveolar ventilation. So if, for example, you have an exaggerated exhalation that you are breathing out a hard breath of air and a fast breath, you're going to lose CO2 from the blood through the lungs. So the loss of carbon dioxide from the blood release more CO2. They're all interlinked. Alveolar CO2, this pressure of CO2 in the small air sacs in the lungs and the alveoli, is under normal circumstances exactly the same as the CO2 in the arterial blood. So whatever changes happen in the lungs, those changes will take place in the blood also. So if your pressure of CO2 in the lungs is normal at 40 millimeters of mercury, then your CO2 in the arterial blood will also be normal at 40 millimeters of mercury. You don't make more room for O2 by breathing out CO2. If you breathe out too much carbon dioxide, the available oxygen that comes in doesn't get readily distributed because of an increased bond between red blood cells and oxygen. So the harder you breathe, the less oxygen gets delivered. So yeah, there's a few different points there. Arthritis all through my body. Another point just from the same person. Looking at Kevin Tracy was a neurosurgeon. I'm not sure if he's still practicing. And I just read it recently, enough Anastasis. Back in 1998, he found that if he could electronically stimulate the vagus nerve, he was able to reduce rheumatoid arthritis. And this is really where breathing is coming in, because we know we can stimulate the vagus nerve by slow breathing, by nose breathing, by diaphragmatic breathing. And by stimulating the vagus nerve to increase vagus nerve traffic, to reduce inflammation, which may be playing a role here. Oftentimes, I think with different people with different pain conditions is that the condition feeds in itself. Like, I suppose, Anastasis, I'd imagine, if I was in chronic pain, and if I didn't know much about breathing, it would be normal for me to be anxious about the chronic pain. And in response to the anxiety, I'm going to breathe harder and faster. This in turn is going to cause muscle spasm, muscle fatigue, increased lactic acid, reduced oxygen delivery, increased pain, reduced pain thresholds, which feeds back into it. It's almost that it's a vicious circle. So I have a slide here. I'm just going to see if I can pull it up, and I'm not sure if it will show quite well with this, but just a slide in terms of looking at the interconnectedness of breathing and pain, because again, it's often something that is likely to be overlooked. So just bear with me 1 second here, and I'll see if I can pull it up. So 1 moment. Yeah, so I have the slide. I was going to make it a bit smaller. And here we are looking at, I'm not sure, can you see that there? Difficult to see. Well, chronic fatigue syndrome, which in turn is lowering CO2, which in turn is increasing blood pH. And as a result, then, we've increased affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. That causes reduced oxygen delivery, which in turn is increasing lactic acid, which in turn is increasing muscle pain. Now, in the central column, we look at lowering PCO2, increased blood pH. The kidneys excrete bicarbonate. Then we have reduced buffering of lactic acid, skeletal muscles fatigue more readily. And then the far column, we've got an increase of blood pH, the central nervous system arousal, increased muscle tension, and increased muscle spasm. And I took that from an article written by Dr. James Bartley, an ENT from New Zealand. And he was referring to temporomandibular joint pain. But of course, it's not just about temporomandibular joint pain, it's about chronic pain, whether it's in the face or different parts of the body. The interconnectedness, or even more so, Anastasis, the importance of functional breathing patterns for helping to alleviate pain.
I like you see me smiling because I really like the pivotal role of increasing blood pH as the root of all the other problems. And of course, I would imagine that people that are on this call are on board with the idea that increasing blood pH is not necessarily ideal. But how many people do we all know that they think that's the ultimate sign of health, increasing blood pH? While in this, it's the other way around. It's the root cause of all these problems.
Yeah, and I can understand how because it's a confusing area, you know. And the other aspect is that if we have an increase of blood pH, and then as a result, then we have increased lactic acid as a result of course, that's going to lower blood pH. But it's tricky, yeah. I was going to move down here a little bit. So breathing during submaximal high-intensity sporting activities like tennis, can you please elaborate on something like this? Do you want to give that a go? So how would you breathe? Sorry, there. How would you breathe, Anastasis? Are you still there?
Yeah.
How would you breathe during submaximal intensity physical exercise? What's your experience with that?
I think nasal breathing. I think maintaining nasal breathing is king, and I think definitely may bring the sensation of suffocation initially, but it's only going to train the CO2 receptors to improve, to become less sensitive, and as a result, be able to increase also my tolerance to carbon dioxide at a not low heart rate. It's a different thing when we are training our body to become good breathers, calm, and the different, which is where oxygen advantage, of course, work comes in. I want to use, do you mind if I put one more, tie that in with something that I always repeat in my workshops from you? There was a lot of the times, one question that I have heard many people asking you many times is like, so is there no point ever we should, when exercising and doing sports, we should open our mouth? And I remember you saying that, you know, like there would probably always be a place and the time for things. So, you know, if you are at the last leg of Olympic race and you want to win the race, then potentially that's not the time necessarily to enforce nasal breathing. But how often do you find yourself in that position? And if you train yourself the rest of the time, you may find that even then you may not need. So I think it is like this, drawing the line between, okay, becoming absolute about things, but then realizing what really means to do the work. I found it I have used this phrase a lot of the times in workshops myself, so I think it ties in with this question.
Yeah, I think all recreational athletes should sustain nasal breathing during exercise. Now, it's influenced by size of noses, though. I see just even you've got a well-developed nose and nasal cavity, whereas mine is absolutely dreadful. So if you have somebody with pinched nostrils, and one nostril is smaller than the other, so anatomically I'm a bit screwed up. So I need to use a nasal dilator to get air in, especially during more intense exercise. Whereas somebody with you that has a really well, you know, proportioned nose and nasal cavity, you'll find that the air hunger is less. But I do agree with you. If we were practicing nasal breathing during physical exercise for about 6 to 8 weeks, the air hunger and the feeling of suffocation diminishes. And then we become more efficient, that we don't need as much air for the same level of intensity of exercise. So it's interesting. Yeah. Just going to look at a couple more and then we'll probably wrap it up because I have a call now as well. So sometimes I deep breath and slow, and when I cry, it's fast breathing and not too deep. And when I sleep, it's through my nose. Is that correct? Well, it's really looking at everyday breathing. It's looking at everyday breathing from light breathing, slow breathing, low breathing. And it's just doing it nice and gently. And of course, good breathing is that breathing will change to the demand upon it. So your breathing during physical exercise is going to be different to your breathing during rest, to your breathing during crying, to your breathing during sleep. And functional breathing is when the breathing adapts appropriately to the activity at hand. So, you know, that's normal. For athletes looking to make progress in aerobic and muscular endurance, how long does the body typically take to adopt proper breath training? How long per day should we be practicing? Well, it depends. It depends on what you're doing, Supernova. It depends on the breathing techniques. But I suppose typically maybe Anastasis, 40 minutes a day is what we're trying to get people to bring into their way of life. And nose breathing during sleep, wearing tape, for example. We use myo tape. Nose breathing during physical exercise. It's really about breathing, Anastasis, is that we carry it with us all day long. So it's not necessarily the formal practice. And I'll give you an example. I remember doing meditation courses, and there were a couple of instructors doing meditation. And I would look at them and I would be so envious because they looked at absolutely like a piece of serenity. They were perfect posture, eyes were closed, they had all the beads and they had robes and everything, yeah? And after the meditation, when they went back to their everyday life, they were total nuts. So they didn't carry what their practice during the meditation into their everyday life. And I think breathing is the same. We need to be thinking of our breathing at different times throughout the day and bringing it into our everyday life. Because I suppose for the Western human being, we've got two options. We're either stuck living in our head, immersed in thought, or we're taking our attention out of the mind onto the breath. And we're, you know, with our attention on our breathing, we are relating to that constant source of calm and tranquility, which the breath can offer us. I'm talking too long here and I've left you too much quiet. So I'm going to give you the final words on Anastasis of, by the way, how would people find you if they want to reach out for you?
I think Instagram is a great place. I try to stay active. Sometimes I need to teach and train and do all the other things that life outside social media. But I think that, yeah, and especially in moving on to the new year, we have discussed that we will be like trying to bring forward more the knowledge and the word that you have been researching. So I think Instagram is a great place to stay in touch, and they can expect more content out from my account, as like you have been putting out in regards to breathing.
Yeah, but I get somebody to do it for me because I absolutely I can't stand it. But you know what? We use it because we have to. If I was to be truthful about the matter. But Anastasis, what's your Instagram handle? Is it or feed?
It is anastasis.janis. So that's TZANIS. They probably can find it as I am like in the same room with you now.
Okay, great stuff. Listen, Anastasis, thank you very much. And to everybody listening, thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks a lot, Patrick.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.